We're very pleased to have with us Dennis McConaughey, and welcome, Dennis.
Good morning. Good afternoon.
And Dennis has written a book about the TransCanada the Keystone XL pipeline saga, and former executive with TransCanada. So Dennis, let's jump right into this. Can you give us an overview of your book and where the implications for the Canadian oil and gas industry?
Sure. So the book was spawned out of my desire to ensure that there was a historical record from someone who had the perspective of being an insider to TransCanada about how the project unfolded, how it was treated, how the entire U.S. regulatory and political system treated it over the course of 7 years, and how the project became a kind of proxy war for the environmental movement, and how that culminated in Obama's rejection of the pipeline in November of 2015. The book also tries to explore what Canada needed to learn from that experience, both in terms of carbon policy and its own need to reconcile credibility on carbon with capturing its hydrocarbon potential. And within that, there were various recommendations related to how our regulatory processes have to become more attuned to ensuring that public interest determinations come early in processes, not late, so that proponents aren't risking literally hundreds of millions of dollars before finding out whether or not they can actually get regulatory and political approval for major infrastructure projects. So those were the motivating reasons that I wrote the book.
One of the things we should talk about is the fact that just this morning, President Donald Trump passed an executive order to smooth the way for the Keystone XL project to be restarted. What's your take on that?
Well, like many people in North America, I'm very interested in actually reading the specific order. At the moment, I've only been able to access the front page in which President Trump has invited TransCanada to reapply to the Department of State. Obviously, various press reports have construed this as essentially Trump reviving the project, and I think that's actually fair to say. So at this point, we're going to await details on the precise form of which this reapplication will unfold. But that much we know. What we do know is this is a fundamental reversal of the Obama position that administration wants to find an acceptable accommodation with TransCanada and possibly Canada on making this pipeline move forward. We also know that this morning the president referred to wanting adjustments into TransCanada's procurement policies related to the project to improve the amount of steel that would be procured in the United States. So that'll be one of the conditions that TransCanada will have to be in discussions and negotiations with the Trump administration. But this is fundamentally very positive news for Canada, TransCanada, Alberta, and frankly, the overall North American energy industry, that this piece of infrastructure is back in play.
Well, let's talk about carbon policy, because you brought
Sure.
up in brought this up in your introductory remarks. Given what happened this morning,
Yes.
does this change your view of how Canada has to handle carbon policy and energy infrastructure projects?
So I have always been of the view that Canada had to have a credible carbon policy if it was going to be able to obtain the kind of support ultimately for these major infrastructure projects. And we need to keep in mind that the Canadian oil sands is one of the world's most carbon intensive sources of crude oil. So of all the sources of crude oil that the world could use, why pick one of the most carbon intensive? Moreover, if Canada was going to expand its production, it was going to be a growing carbon emitter. So how do you square this circle in a world that wanted to deal with climate change? And my contention always was that Canada had to resort to carbon pricing as a way of saying to the world, we economically internalized the cost that's implicit in carbon emissions. And I think that was substantially important in terms of how the Trudeau government was able to rationalize its approval for the Kinder Morgan project and Enbridge's line 3. Now, I fully recognize that under a Trump administration, they may not identify with carbon pricing. They may not even identify with carbon and climate change as a material risk. Although I think anyone who looked at Secretary Tillerson's remarks during his confirmation hearings would see that the Trump administration, where it finally lands on this, there's some distance to go. But I am fundamentally of the view that Canada has to have a credible carbon policy if it's going to be able to move forward with these kinds of projects. At the moment, I would say that it does. The concern for Canada is going to be going forward is the terms of its carbon policy, which is primarily anchored in pricing. How will that have to adjust in order to preserve Canadian competitiveness in this sector? And that's going to be one of the emerging challenges for the Trudeau government.
Now, there's a substantial political contingent in Alberta that disagrees with you, including the leader of the opposition party, Brian Jean, and the presumptive future leader of the Progressive Party, Jason Kenney. And also a significant part of the Alberta-based industry, especially the small and medium-sized producers, which don't even believe in climate science. How does that all get reconciled? Or does it matter given the fact that the Trudeau government is leading the parade on this issue?
Well, so that's a great, that is in fact a great answer. Like, if Alberta was expecting to get approvals out of the Trudeau government, and it has actually achieved at least 3 significant approvals. Kinder Morgan, and also the 2 LNG facilities, that one of which was being led by Petronas that came out late last fall as well, and then the Line 3 expansion. Those approvals by the Trudeau government, in effect, I don't think would have been possible without Alberta having at least moved in the direction of carbon pricing in a serious way. And likewise, their national pricing standard was trying to give kind of boots and suspenders. So my challenge to conservative critics of carbon pricing is, do you really think you are going to get federal approvals for these kinds of projects without carbon pricing? And the Alberta economy is an economy that really is driven by expanding production and expanding investment. And I think in this case, carbon pricing, carbon taxes had to be seen in the broader context. So, I mean, I just fundamentally don't agree with those who say that carbon pricing we didn't need. Now, I will acknowledge one point. The advent of Donald Trump creates a competitiveness issue, but that really goes to the level of the carbon tax in Alberta over time. And that's an adjustment mechanism that I think the carbon tax structure can accommodate. So, I mean, I don't apologize for the position I take. I think it's fundamentally the only one that Canada can resort to.
Well, let's talk about the Keystone XL being revived. And so let's say that happens and Secretary Tillerson gives his approval, the construction begins. Now we've got the American environmental movement has declared that it will revive its opposition to Keystone XL. And it seems to me that given the Standing Rock protest over Dakota Access, that the protests that are expected, the opposition that's expected for Kinder Morgan project in Burnaby and the Lower Mainland BC, it seems that the opposition has taken another step or two in terms of its size and sophistication. What are you expecting that opposition to look like, and will it be able to achieve a delay or a cancellation of the project given a President Trump administration?
I have no idea the intensity or the kinds of tactics the environmental movement and their supporters are going to resort to. In terms of on the ground obstruction or efforts to obstruct and other forms of civil disobedience. I think it's fairly clear that the Trump administration is going to enforce the rights of project proponents that are that exist. I think the same expectation exists for the Trudeau government and other provincial governments in Canada, that people who have valid permits have every right to have their projects proceed and to have the governments stand behind their approvals. So the challenge, I mean, I would believe that the Trump administration and also ultimately the state governments in Montana, South Dakota, and Nebraska will enforce the law. Enforce the law, which means enforcing the rights of proponents. I have the same expectation for XL in Alberta between Hardisty and the Montana-Alberta border. And I would ultimately believe that that will also apply in British Columbia, however difficult that becomes. So people like Bill McKibben and others can say we're going to mount the same kind of protests on the ground. But ultimately, proponents have rights, have legal rights that have gone through due process. And we have the expectation the governments are going to stand behind them. And that's where I would, that's my expectation of how this is going to play out over the next 2 to 3 years. Governments will stand behind these approvals.
Given that expectation, what lessons did TransCanada learn in the first go round with Keystone XL that it can apply to the upcoming project?
Well, obviously, the real disconnect in the first go round had more to do with the ultimate identification of the Obama administration with the arguments that certain environmentalists had been making about the oil sands resource was just too carbon intensive to enable, to facilitate, to resort to. That's not going to be in play this time. But the lessons of trying to provide local accommodations when they are, where they are possible, trying to ensure that the land settlements for access are done in a manner that is both professional and within the reasonable financial expectations of landowners, that they will try to apply all the lessons that they've learned up to this part, dealing with the circumstances both in Nebraska and in the other states. So they have that body of learning to rely upon. And so it's my expectation that, like, to actually build this pipeline, they have that body of experience in those local communities to try to ensure that these, when they redo it over the next 2 to 3 years, that they are reducing the on-the-ground alienation of specific landowners when they come to make their access settlements. What they're not going to have is a federal government that's fundamentally equivocal about the entire notion of Canadian dilbit going through pipes through the U.S. mid-continent. And so that, in that respect, it should be, there should be much better alignment in that respect, and that will be a major benefit to actually getting this thing constructed within the timelines that will ultimately be set down by TransCanada and its commercial customers, which I would expect would be in the next 2 years or so.
Okay, fair enough. Now, I've had an opportunity to speak a number of times with TransCanada's media department, and
Yes.
one of the comments that struck me as being interesting was that when TransCanada started this project, it was taken aback by a lot of the opposition, and that the corporate culture had to change to accommodate some of these concerns that you've just been talking about.
Yes.
And that would therefore leave them much better equipped for future projects or for Keystone XL if it goes ahead. Could you
Yes.
address the issue of that change? How, I mean, you sat around the table, you were part of the team. How did
Yes.
that corporate culture within TransCanada change in response to the opposition it saw the first time around?
Well, I would say this. I think TransCanada is better equipped to ensure that facts about the project are being disseminated in all different kinds of media platforms, whether it's social media, print media, electronic media. And it's one of the great learnings, one of the great things that had to be acquired in process under that first experience with Keystone was the enormous need to react in social media platforms in real time, because there were so many occasions where there were contentions made that TransCanada had to rebut, and it had to rebut on cycle times that it had never had to deal with before. So its capacity to do these things, I think, is in better shape now than it was before. In terms of culture, I think I can say quite proudly that I think TransCanada tried to be civil, professional, and always come back to what it saw were the actual facts that pertained, whether those facts related to spill risks, economic benefits, toxicity of spilled dilbit, attributable carbon emissions, etc. So I think that they will persist, and I think that comes right from the leadership at the top, because anyone who's observed how Russ Girling, the CEO of TransCanada, has conducted himself, I think being civil, being sticking to the facts of the matter, and being consistent, I think are really the cultural attributes that I think TransCanada will move forward. But they have more capacity now and more experience to deal with social media assaults than they did before. And I think they also have a body of experience to deal with the kinds of, I'll say, representations that parts of the environmental movement are going to make about this project and about, their carrying out of the project. So they have that experience to draw on.
I want to ask you a question. I don't know if this can even be answered at this point in the game, but one of the tactics that the Dakota Access protesters have used is to go after the financing behind the project. Yes. So we saw the DNB Bank of Norway come out and say, "Look, we're concerned about how this is being handled." Now we're seeing some of the American banks do the same kind of thing. Do you think that there's any chance that tactic will be used against Keystone XL, and how vulnerable might TransCanada be to that tactic?
Well, I don't actually set much concern about that tactic, frankly. I think most of TransCanada's, the way they're going to finance this pipeline is in the context of them enjoying an A credit rating. I think there's many lenders across North America, if not the world, who will be eager to lend money to TransCanada on the debt component of this project, if not equity investors. I think you could have seen this morning that the share price of TransCanada went up significantly just on the news of this morning. As far as debt markets are concerned, that there will be, I don't foresee any lack of access for TransCanada, given that it is an A credit, to access financial markets for whatever debt components. And just as a specific example, like if one expected that TransCanada had significant banking relationships with Canada's chartered banks, I mean, those people are well aware of the significance of this resource to the Canadian economy. I think they're well positioned to take a balanced, considerate view. And ultimately, and I think this is really important to understand, Canada is a country that's embraced carbon pricing. So, the environmental movement's going to ask of itself, what more do you want of Canada in terms of simply walking away from the development of a resource when, frankly, the rest of the world is going to still have almost no reduction in global crude oil demand out to 2040, 2050. So is Canada going to impose on itself more cost for carbon, to dealing with the carbon risk than other countries? So I think taken in total, I see no lack of ability of TransCanada to finance this project.
What does Keystone XL mean for the oil sands going forward? Now we've seen you mentioned Trans Mountain expansion, the replacement of Line 3. Now we're yes. It was only a few months ago that we were talking about limited capacity, bursting at the seams. Now we've got it appears we have all this new capacity that'll be coming on fairly soon. What does it mean for the future expansion of the oil sands, say, over the next 10 years?
Okay, so let's address that in two parts. The advent of Keystone XL improves transportation economics the minute it goes into service relative to rail cars. Something on the order of, if the last rail car going out in Alberta today is a cost of $15 a barrel, and you can appreciate what that means in the context of the $50 oil price. If the tariff on Keystone XL is roughly half that number, that's a significant cash flow saving to the industry, to the Alberta Treasury, and to Canada in terms of federal taxes. More importantly, going forward, the 1 million barrels of total capacity that XL represents means that there will be some of that capacity that will be able to take up incremental production that will be, I think, we'll see evidence of that from all those projects that are on the drawing board that are constrained in part because the price of oil is only at $50, but also the uncertainties of market access. So I think you're going to see more capital spending in the wake of this decision, and that'll be capital spending that will put Alberta engineers back to work, and that's a significant element to this economy. I think the other point that just to emphasize here, Keystone XL links Alberta in the most efficient way possible to its most lucrative market, the market on the US Gulf Coast for refineries that are optimized to run on heavy oil slates. So a point I always try to make to people is Canada isn't crowded out necessarily by the advent of more Bakken oil production or other shale oil production, because its dilbit is actually a very good fit for most of the or some of the refineries on the Gulf Coast that are designed and optimized to run on a heavy oil slate. So Keystone represents a link to that premium market. But this is why the Kinder Morgan project is so important. It provides tidewater access. So Canada would then also enjoy the ability to access other markets in other parts of the world if that became economically appropriate. And of course, Alberta producers and foreign markets will optimize that mix of where that oil should optimally go. But I think those are the 2 points that I would immediately say why it's such a boon to Canada and Alberta for the completion of this project.
One of the things that we've seen is that both Mexico and Venezuela and Nigeria,
Yes.
which are Canada's primary competitors in heavy down in the Gulf Coast, appear to be having problems with their production. And
Yes.
does a Keystone XL, by having, let's say, the pipeline tariff, does that really give us Canada the opportunity to pick up more market share down in that market?
Well, I think it certainly creates the opportunity to do that. And keep in mind, when Keystone was always organized with solid shipper support for most of the volumes in the pipe. So that means that various refiners and Alberta producers had made long-term commitments to that. But I would agree directionally with your observation that the advent of Keystone XL lets Canada compete against those countries that either show some kind of, an inability to maintain their fields production because of their own political structures or just the pure reality of their reservoirs. And so the diversification to American refiners of backward integrating to Canada, I think, has always been one of the driving forces of XL. And I would expect that trend to continue once it's installed, because there's a capacity in Alberta to expand production. And there's now a major pipe conduit that takes us all the way to the Gulf Coast on the most economic terms that I personally believe are available. This direct interior route through the mid-continent.
Well, Dennis, we've talked about a lot of issues with respect to Keystone XL and the oil sands. Are there any issues that we should be talking about that we haven't talked about today?
Well, I think the only one that I would reiterate is a real test in the next 2 years is the capacity of governments to enforce their decisions. Okay, and I think that's going to be vital in Canada, because we can understand that they have approved some pipelines, we can understand that they support XL, and we can understand they recognize the economic value. But they're going to have to be up for the job of actually enforcing this on the ground against potentially those who are just implacably opposed to the expansion of the oil sands in the context of their views about how the world is ever going to get to 2 degrees C. So on another occasion, we can talk about the implausibility of ever achieving 2 degrees C, the implausibility of Canada meeting its current Paris targets, which I view should be viewed more as aspiration than targets. But I would just come back to say, I think a real challenge that we all have to be focused on is existing governments are going to have to enforce their approvals. And that's something that they should be speaking to and being unequivocal about.
Let me ask your opinion then. We'll make this our last question, and we'll open it up for some questions from the attendees. But my working hypothesis is that the Trump administration and the Trudeau government will take very different approaches to enforcing it. The Trudeau government will seek to build political legitimacy around the projects. It will build coalitions of supporters. It will line things up so that it can build the political support that it needs to enforce their decisions, just as you said. The Trump administration, supported by Jack Gerard at API, by Kelsey Ward at ETP, are taking a more hardline rule of law approach. and which may turn out, in my view, to lead to more conflict and more problems getting projects built in the short to medium term than the Canadian approach. What's your take on that?
Well, I would just say that I think it would be naive to think that with all of the consultation and empathy that the Trudeau government is going to show to those who are concerned about the advent of expanded oil sands production, they are still going to have to confront civil disobedience on the ground. They're not going to be able to empathy their way out of that. So I just would say to you that I think it is important to try to have dialogue with those who are going to be at odds with this development. But the development is not illegal. The development is been approved through the infrastructure. And at some point, the rights of proponents have to be respected. So, I mean, I would just say this. I applaud the Trudeau government by trying to listen to concerns and accommodate where possible. But I don't believe they're going to be able to avoid the same practical matter that at some point the law's got to be enforced. And that really means clearing the right of way of people who are obstructing the process of digging a trench, laying a pipe, and moving down the right of way. So, I mean, I just would offer you, this is going to be a test of these people, regardless that I agree, showing some empathy for those who are alienated by these decisions is an appropriate thing to do, but it doesn't, in my mind, obviate the need to show some capacity to enforce their own decisions. So interesting times ahead for Justin Trudeau.
The reason I'm smiling, Dennis, is because I'm a regular, I'm the energy guy at a couple of Vancouver radio stations. And you have no idea how many times I've predicted that Justin Trudeau was going to throw Derek Corrigan, the mayor of Burnaby, in jail in short order.
Yes.
And
well,
I
we'll
think,
see.
well, I think that Canadian Natural Resources Minister Jim Carr has made it very clear where the government stands on that, and that in fact the decision will be enforced by the power of by their legal authority. So
I think that was one of Carr's best comments, actually.
yes, I would have. I wrote a column about it, and I said that was the perfect response. That's exactly what the government of Canada should have said at that moment about that issue. So we've come to the end of my questions, and what I'd like to do now is throw it open to some of our attendees. So folks, if you have a question for Dennis McConaughey, please write it in the chat, and then I will ask on your behalf. And I know we've got some industry people in the audience, so I'm sure there'll be some very penetrating questions. So let's, while you're doing that, Dennis and I will continue to chat a little bit. And I'm a little worried, Dennis, about the direct action. You remember the climate direct action folks back in the fall, the ones that tampered with the 5 pipelines? I think that is going to be an issue going forward. I think that we're going to see a more militant opposition than the TransCanada team did the first time around. What's industry's take on that? Are they expecting that kind of direct action?
Well, I think if they are, I think they're going to be prepared for it. I think they're going to be prepared for it in terms of security arrangements and coordination with the authorities to ensure that those risks are minimized as much as possible. Because ultimately, it's my belief that if the government show the willpower and the conviction to uphold the law, ultimately in our society, at least I think people, get that message. And moreover, I think the general public would recognize that we've got democratic elections, and out of that process, there are regulatory decisions that are politically that are sanctioned. I think the vast majority of Canadians would identify that we have a carbon policy. If these pipelines are in accordance with those carbon policies, then they have every right to proceed. So my own view is, from a pipeline company perspective, this is a risk and a security issue, and that's how they're going to deal with it.
Dennis, thank you very much for joining us today. We haven't got any other questions, so we're going to wrap it up. I'm sure as the Keystone XL controversy ramps up again, that we'll be doing this again in another 2 or 3 months or even sooner. But thank you very much for today. And we should point out, maybe you want to put a little plug for your book.
Well, I appreciate that. My book, Dysfunction, I think is on the bookstores, on most of the electronic platforms to access a book these days. And it really, I think, is still very relevant given that everything that we came through with the Obama administration are still the basic issues for Canada. How do we develop our endowment on hydrocarbons and be credible on carbon? And I think that remains a challenge for Canada, regardless of whether Donald Trump is president. So I invite people to take a look at the ideas I have in the book and enjoy the conversation and debate that comes out of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and it's been a pleasure.